I'm very excited to introduce these three next panelists. First, we have Gary Briggs, who's the CMO of Facebook. Next, we have Jennifer Knuckles, CMO of Zynga. Last but not least, we have Bill Masitis, who started his career at consumer tech startups and most recently joined Slack as their very first marketer and CMO. So join me in welcoming our panelists today. I suspect that this was the third most voted actual topic when we sent our pre-event survey because people don't really understand the value of brand building at the early stage. So that's my first question to you guys is, what's the importance of this? And does it make sense for the companies in the room who, many of them are early stage companies? Jennifer?
Sure. So I grew up in traditional brand management. So I spent a decade at Procter & Gamble and the Clorox company. And when I think about brand building, I think a lot of people associate brand campaigns with traditional above-the-line campaigns like media, television. I actually think that it's important to build your brand in all of the channels, regardless of the stage of your product. So before I came to Zynga, I was CMO at Plum District, which is a Kleiner portfolio company. It was very, very early, and we were constantly focused on growing our user base. Every consumer outreach was a reflection of our brand. And so what I mean by that is every time you're in front of the eyes of your target audience, you want to make sure that your positioning is consistent, the equity is consistent. So every time that one member of the target audience sees your brand, they associate it with the look and feel that you're supporting, right? Because your audience is going to see it less times than you do. So if you as a marketer feel that you're seeing it and it's repetitive, that's a good thing because it means that the few times your audience sees your message, it resonates with them and you stand for your single most important takeaway.
But is it important? Arguably, for mature companies, brand is a differentiator. And so I think for a lot of folks in the room, the question is, why at this point, we have so many other things to be thinking about. Is brand something that's important that should be on my priority list today? Gary, do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there are two things. There's certainly exceptions, but they're quite rare where they don't really focus on brand at all. We were talking actually before about WhatsApp. WhatsApp, I think, extremely successful, great product market fit. Didn't really focus on brand, actually hasn't really focused on brand. That is largely the exception, and I would contrast that to other businesses. If you take more established businesses like Uber and Airbnb, I think Uber, in particular, I would say, is having a hard time right now because their brand is such an aggressive brand that are having regulatory issues when in fact they're being disruptive in the sense that Airbnb is being disruptive, and I think Airbnb largely is not having the same kind of regulatory public sentiment issues that Uber's having, because I think Airbnb has been more focused on brand out of the gate than Uber has been. So I think those are important things you have to think about in terms of brand. Doesn't necessarily just mean I always joke that I kind of feel like I walk around with a post-it on my forehead that says ad guy, and brand is a lot more than just videos and ads. It's a sense of what are you representing in the world to people who are going to interact with you, and that can be regulators, that can be consumers, that can be customers. It's broad range, but depending on the business you're in, you have to kind of get that right at the start, or I think you can get yourself into trouble longer.
Yeah, Bill, you started off saying that you own every customer-facing function for the company. So how do you actually invest in brand then?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just the definition of the brand, and Gary touched on it a little bit. I think if you think brand is just the marketing people, it's a really wrong viewpoint. I think, to me, a brand is the sum of every single interaction a customer has with you. And that's going to pull in every single team. The first time they see their ad, the first time they talk with someone in sales, first time they go through a trial, the first time they talk with someone in support, every one of those interactions is a touch point. I think another way to look at it, like in the B2B, the enterprise peeps, that's right, I see you all in the blue. A lot of times it's all about short-term leads. And to me, brand is long-term leads. You can do a lot of things to juice your short-term revenue. You can put gates in front of a lot of stuff. You can call people before they're ready, and you might get a short-term increase in those leads, but it's going to have a really negative experience. And to me, brand is all about making sure you're looking at that cumulative net experience, which is going to drive your long-term organic growth.
I think this actually segues nicely to a question about the tension between growth and customer acquisition, which a lot of you are focused on, and brand building. There's a natural tension that happens, especially at early stage companies. Can you talk about that and how that sort of manifests itself even at your companies today?
When I was at eBay, we'd run a lot of online ads, and you actually could see, based upon the strength of the brand in various markets, that online advertising would work better or not, right? So the sense of the perception of your brand obviously is very connected to what you see through your growth tactics. So I think there is a tension in terms of there's sometimes a perception that brand people are more focused on making things pretty, and growth people are more focused on making things effective. And I would say, actually, you got to be able to do both.
But is it true? Because you started off telling us today the functions that you own.
Yeah.
You didn't say you own customer acquisition, certainly, at Facebook.
Right, growth is a separate department,
And so there's got to be tension that I imagine exists at Facebook when you think about that.
Yeah, there is, although I think over time that we're actually, in practical terms, working closer and closer together, because to the point I was making a second ago, there's the recognition that kind of has to happen. I think, Facebook went a long time without having a central marketing department. I'm actually the first person who's run kind of a central, relatively central, I should say, marketing department at Facebook. And in large part because we were focused, I think, on things like product market fit. But we have had people doing brand activities for a long time. It just wasn't necessarily as centralized. And I think there's now the recognition that needs to happen.
Bill, you're at an earlier stage company, presumably. So how do you think about growth versus with brand?
Yeah, well, we don't separate it out. Again, a lot of our viewpoint is that it's a sum of every single person's experience as they come through. Word of mouth has been really the main driver for Slack's success. I think the bars we look at are not, did we get someone to come in and sign up with us, or even did they renew, but are they likely to recommend us? That's why we spend a lot of time on NPS, but we really kind of more mine through it from a growth perspective of mining out the negative experiences that someone has throughout their entire customer life cycle. And managing all the customer-facing teams, it makes it much easier for me, because you don't have those disjointed handoffs, or you don't have teams that are incentivized on very short-term metrics. And I think that's the hard thing with growth, is that, it depends who you talk to, but a lot of times growth hackers have a negative connotation, and that can come from, we don't believe in the growth hacking where it's like, mine into your address book and send out 20 invites. It's just a bad way to do it. But if we can make that funnel have less friction, that we can make people have a better experience, and that they're going to recommend us more, that's really what we focus on at Slack.
Jennifer?
I agree with everything that's been said. I think what I can add to this discussion is, so I do manage user acquisition. I also manage the brands. And those two groups work very closely together at Zynga. And it's really important because if you think about the value of your integrated message every time you're reaching with single consumer, you want it to be the same. And so our performance marketers, who are measured on growth in installs and the cost per install and the LTV of every paid acquisition that we get, they really partner with the product marketers to understand what the motivations are, what the insights are, what the brand strategy is, and make sure that that's carried through with all of the advertising. Because essentially our paid acquisition is advertising tactics in market. At the same time, I think the user acquisition team is really, really helpful to the product marketing team, because if we're looking to test new campaigns or new communication points, we can rapidly do that essentially through A/B testing through paid Facebook ads. And we can get a read on that in a day or so as to which campaign is converting the quickest and the best. So I guess my take on this is, as long as it's delivering on the consistent consumer strategy and resonating with the audience, both of those channels work very closely together, which is best for the business.
Which brings me to my next question about the balance between, or how you think about the marketing mix. Bill and Jennifer started to talk about this. When I think about paid versus earned versus owned, so for those of you who don't know what that means, paid is what Jennifer was talking about, advertising on Facebook, for example. Earned is when your content is being promoted by others, and that could be through PR or social media or word of mouth. And owned is when you create your own content, right, for your website or for a blog or videos that you are creating. How do you think about the mix? And now put your hat on, for either when the company was really early or when you were at a startup. What kind of advice would you give to these companies in terms of that mix today? Because a lot of companies don't have big budgets. They have to be very efficient about this. So how do they think about that mix between paid, owned, and earned?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got to get the owned right at the start. So the mechanics, and gets to product, we talked about product market fit, but just the mechanics of what drives attention and stickiness to whatever you're building is really important, and figuring out what opportunities you have for better kind of owned capabilities within your own product. So I think that a lot of companies will end up kind of skipping past that and want to go to some big events and PR and things like that. I think figuring out those mechanics is probably the most fundamental thing to do. And I think then the other things kind of come after that. So despite the fact that I kind of grew up in brand, I mean, I ended up, when I joined eBay about 12 years ago, moved much more into digital. I think getting the product mechanics right out of the gate is kind of the most paramount thing. And certainly I work for a company that makes its money off of paid advertising, but I think that's probably third.
But do any of you, I mean, especially for early stage companies, I'm a big believer that your product can actually, represent your brand. And so when I think about companies like Uber, there's very clear brand attributes around efficiency and convenience. And that's built into their product, into their features that they build. So do any of you actually have any influence over the products that are being built at your companies or when you were at earlier stage companies?
Definitely at Slack. I think the role of the marketing has changed and evolved over the years. I think for a lot of people, the more limited view is that marketing was just about creating leads or interest and then they would stop. And I think a much more evolved view now is that marketing is about the entire life cycle and that they're going to be able to interact with the product teams, with the support teams, all those different interactions. I think it's really about you have to get that product fit and you have to focus on your organic growth. Look, if you want to grow and you want to get logarithmic growth, you have to have healthy organic growth. Like you can't get around that. We always use paid. Paid is a model to get you into new verticals, new segments, new geos. But once you get those new customers here, they have to be successful and they have to start recommending other people. Otherwise, you're going to have your entire model is going to be built on paid growth and it'll never be sustainable. The ROI, the CAC, the payback, it'll kill you. So, I'm just a big believer, you've got to think about what are those core customer metrics, those NPS, CSAT, transactional, all the way through the line so you understand, do you have a healthy business? And again, you can't just look at marketing at that. That's got to be an entire company that pitches in there for that. And then use paid to supplement it to get you into new areas.
Jennifer?
Yeah, so I agree with that. So I think at Zynga, the influence that I have is over the entire slate, and that's new for Zynga. So it's very much similar to how I grew up, where marketing partnered with R&D, which is essentially product, right? So product development. So if you think about the product life cycle and you identify what the white space is in market, what your competitive point of differentiation is, what your consumers are kind of lacking, and then you lead to that to develop your slate and your new product features or even a new product launch, that's really where marketing can come into play, because you can see how big the product is going to be, how disruptive it can be, if there's actually a need in market. Whereas, and it's essentially risk mitigation as well, right? Because you look at the cost of developing a product. If it's not going to succeed in market, that's an opportunity cost that resources could be redeployed elsewhere. So marketing shouldn't just be SEO or the face of a website or brand campaigns. A lot of people talk about brand campaigns as traditional advertising. The brand standards have to live within the product, which I think you're hearing consistently across this panel. In terms of the marketing mix, and I can speak to both at scale, and Zynga's very, very largely at scale. Gary was alluding to this, but we spend a tremendous amount of money on Facebook advertising every year, which is, yeah, you're welcome, to drive the top of the funnel. And just to be clear, Facebook makes a lot of money organically off of us as well. That being said, when I was...
Now we're negotiating.
Yeah, we are. Let's take that back. We should manage it holistically. Before I was at Zynga, I was at a smaller stage startup, and we really doubled down on our owned media and our earned media. And what I mean by that is all of the content that we could control the voice of to our customer was really, really important. So if you think about the reflection of your brand in your blog or emails you send out to your daily customer base or your social media posts, it's all a direct reflection of what you want to stand for in the news that you're communicating to your audience. We were also able to get earned media by talking to, local market influencers or influencers that are relevant to the product life cycle and have them speak to our product evangelists on our behalf. It was only once we were able to get to a certain base that we started engaging in paid media. And once you engage in paid media, there's a lot of different tools and tricks to get it to scale, right? But you want to make sure that you actually have the proposition that you're communicating in market first, because otherwise you're essentially wasting those ad dollars. The ad dollars are really, really important because they allow you to get the reach and the awareness that are necessary to take you from that first kind of trajectory of user growth to the next. But I would first, at the level of startups, smaller stage startups, really look at your earned and your owned.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing, if I could just simplify for the group, owned and earned, you really want to exhaust those channels, I think, before you actually enter into the paid part of your marketing mix. And I think that's pretty common across a lot of the startups that I'm talking to as well. So, we've talked a lot about these different tactics and what the marketing mix looks like. Can you share some of the best examples, the most effective examples of marketing initiatives, either at your companies or something you've seen recently at some other startups? Bill?
Oh man, I hate giving out the best tactics because CPMs are going to rise up. On the paid side, podcast advertising has been awesome for us. I mean, it's early adopters. We've seen just tremendous amount, no matter what we look at, whether it's CAC payback, whether it's LTV, whether it's even like sentiment and brand lift. I think that's been great. I mean, obviously you got to know what your demographics are, and obviously that should drive the channels for it. We actually created our own podcast, the Slack Variety Pack. Balance of life and work. It's a really cool podcast, and that's where we can actually control what that content is, give our customers a nice, great experience for that. That's been well. The one thing I would say too is on the branded side, I think a lot of people, they're like, how do I track this? And in the past, you had to do really expensive ways. They would track down, decision makers at airports, and it cost like $500,000. Like you can do now, you can go to just SurveyMonkey. They've got like a 10 million panel. You can get aided, unaided, sentiment, aided, unaided recall. And those are great brand metrics that you can just start tracking. You get a baseline, do it every quarter, and that'll give you a lot more direction on where your brand is heading. And not only that, but just for your competitors as well. So it's a really easy way to get it started.
Mm-hmm. I like that new medium podcast. I'm going to just do a plug for Kleiner. We do a podcast as well. So anyway, Jennifer, I'd love to hear yours.
So growing up in traditional marketing, we did all of the very expensive consumer testing, which is really important when you're testing television advertising to make sure that you don't spend the non-working budget, which is the cost of production, if the spot's not going to succeed in market, right? So there's a bunch of benchmarks that you would read, whether it's like awareness, recall, persuasion. You can look at your net promoter score. You should always track your equity, which is kind of a pre and post. So even at the startup stage, you understand from a group of consumers how they respond to your brand, and then after they've seen your communication, if they can recall it and if the positive attributes stood out versus the pre. So one thing that I would recommend is forming that panel that was mentioned. And I did this both at scale at Zynga, so now we have a panel of 100,000 members. These are players who have played all of our products as well as our competitive products. And the really great thing about this is I keep this panel warm and I reach out to them on an ongoing basis to talk to them about new features, new product development ideas, communication points, what they would want to see in market. And it's a really great way to develop a one-to-one relationship with your consumer. You can do this not at scale as well. So when I was at my previous startup, this was the first time that we had brought consumers into the office. We brought them in, we did one-on-one interviews to hear qualitatively from them what was important. And then again, we formed kind of a small scale panel, and we called them our most valuable buyers that we would go out to repeatedly to understand what was important. So I think those are really good things to do, both at scale and at smaller.
Jennifer, you were just talking about how you understand your customers. Mm-hmm. How rich are those customer profiles? And what do you do at Facebook that we can learn from in terms of best practices in understanding them?
Yeah. I mean, we there's a couple things, I guess. It is one, because we have such a large platform, we do a lot of surveys through the platform, which people don't really pick up on, but just because the number's big. But we see right now we have 22,000 completed surveys every day. And we're looking constantly at everything from brand health issues to usage issues to lots of other things we might be asking through an internal product that we've built. So that gives us, as you can imagine, a very rich data that allows us to break it down by segment, geography, and product life cycle. Tenure, we look at tenure a lot in terms of how many days over the last 28 days have you used the product and how is that changing, things like that. Those are particularly important to us. Back to the point, the metric we kind of look at a lot is time spent. So basically, recency is pretty critical for that.
Mm-hmm. And Bill, you mentioned using SurveyMonkey. Are there other hacks for some of these early stage companies?
Yeah, a great hack for those in the business or enterprise space. If you're doing any type of advertising on LinkedIn, which is a great social graph for the business side of it, you can put a pixel on your homepage, and then you can look at all the traffic coming into your site. What exactly are the demographics, psychographics of those users? So that was like one of the first questions I got asked by my board was, all right, are we still just having developers coming to us? Like, is it different functional roles? And it was pretty cool. Like, we were able to get that data and show, no, actually, it's very diversified now for Slack. We're getting people from marketing teams coming, sales teams, finance teams. You can get which segment they're coming from. And that's really important because you have to narrow in on like who is that initial buyer. So when you are going out with your paid media, you're buying it efficiently and effectively.
So I'm going to change topics slightly and talk a little bit about community. We're seeing a lot of really successful tech brands like Uber and Airbnb and Nextdoor invest in community. And I don't know that I'd love to understand how you three are thinking about community building and if it really scales. What I'm seeing in some of these companies, for example, is a lot of the face-to-face aspect of brand building and the community. And that's, there's so much engagement there, but the reality is it's very costly, and I'm not sure it's the right ROI. So how do you guys think about community?
Yeah, I mean, I was at eBay a long time ago, and 2001 when I interviewed with Meg Whitman, remember through going through that interview process, she said to me, what eBay really is a collection of neighborhoods. And when she was talking about the collection of neighborhoods, she was kind of getting to the fact that, we famously had people who were into Beanie Babies and philatelists and all sorts of things that people were into. And a core part of eBay certainly was community. And I actually make the argument that I think eBay, in large part, getting away from that kind of the connection that they had through community was a huge mistake. And because you need that for we were talking about brand in the beginning, to really have that collection of people who are kind of rabid enthusiasts, that's really community. And then people, will attach themselves to that in various ways, whether it's through a particular, interest area, whether that's, a topical one or a commercial one. I think having that kind of core group, and, at the peak when we were kind of running community, we had an event called eBay Live. And at our peak year, I think we had 16,000 people come to eBay Live, which was basically a lot of collections of sellers. And it was a carnival. It was a total kind of crazy time. Looking at Mary, who was probably there. But
was it one event in one location?
One event, and we once a year we got together and we did. I can't remember how many years we did it. I think we did about 6 years or so. But it grew from a couple thousand our first year, which I think was in Irvine, up to the peak year, which was about 16,000. And that we looked at that, and we used to look at it in terms of how much of our gross merchandise value was in the room. That was one of the things we used as the metric that finance, I would say, by the way, uses the metric to talk about. It was actually the wrong metric. And the reason it was the wrong metric is that the influence of that group of people on the larger group of people who are actually part of the eBay community was really quite significant, because as we were looking at things like product changes, or we were looking at things of policy changes, they were the folks that we ended up working through to make those decisions and really understand. Now, I think at times we made the wrong calls about making changes, and we were too reticent to make changes because we were over-serving the community. But certainly having that avenue and having that connection out to your user base, I think, is pretty critical for lots of companies, particularly in the consumer space. Though Slack, I think you guys are doing in the enterprise space, doing an amazing job of creating community in an arena that not necessarily people have thought about before.
Yeah, I would argue that a lot of people say that community is not particularly scalable. So I'm really curious about how you guys, I know your example was a physical example where people gathered. How are you building communities online today? And is that more efficient?
And I think community is kind of a broad term. I think sometimes it can come down to simple decisions like product roadmap. I've had discussions with Stuart on this. The classic product marketer would be like, lock that puppy down. Do not let any news of new features go out because we want to maximize it for maximum press. And Stuart's always been really open with our product roadmap because he thinks he would rather have our end customers understand like what we're doing and get excited about that, and just think about that community, right? Slack it's interesting. It's more for businesses. It's a messaging app for teams. But we have seen a lot of like local communities start springing up around Slack, like iOS developers, digital nomads. I think it's like 5,000 people. It's all talking about people that just how they work out on the road, remotely, virtually. They kind of come together from that perspective. So
are these communities that Slack has built, or you've just found them organically out?
They've organically popped up, yeah.
And then how do you engage and nurture those communities as Slack, because you kind of don't want to own them and manage them because they're self-organized? Yeah,
it's a fine line for us because we've publicly stated we don't want to go in that direction, more on the B2C side or self-organized community. So we still we recognize where they're out there. We really try to just spend a lot of time on understanding like who are people that really love Slack, what can we do to help inspire them, educate them. We leverage a lot of the content that our community has already created. And I think, at the end of the day, you just want to have that connection where you can make sure that you're understanding who are your biggest passionate.
Sorry, maybe this is a dumb question, but what kind of content are these communities creating? They're just, I love Slack. What are they saying? What are they doing? This is enterprise products. So
a tremendous amount around onboarding. Onboarding tips, best practices, best integrations that they're using, cool tips around how to use Slack, how to do a quick switcher, edit your messages. We have our own content team, but it's like, 1 or 2 people, right? And then we have this entire mass 1.1 million daily active users, right? And they're creating a tremendous amount of content. So, it's another thing, I've always viewed content is not just what you create, it's what your entire community creates, right? And being able to leverage that effectively is something that can give them a better experience.
very interesting. Many of the CEOs in the room are just starting to think about building their marketing teams, and we've talked about a lot of different things here today. So I'm curious what kind of talent they should be looking for, sort of what experience level, what parts of the marketing mix should they have touched. And I noted early on that Bill was the first marketer at Slack and yet the CMO. And I see a lot of our companies actually start the other way, which is bet on someone young, high potential, and grow into the role. Do you have any advice for our CEOs in the room who are thinking about this function now? Building this function now?
Yeah, it's a hard role, and part of it kind of gets back to your culture. What type of company do you want to run? Do you want it to be about long-term brand? Is it short-term transactional? That's going to, I think, make decisions on if you do more analytic hires first, or if you do more kind of like the brand hires. I think the key thing is after you make that first hire, you have to start building out those teams. I like building in the analytics first because they're going to do the marketing tech stack. They're going to have all the visibility about what those analytics look like. Content marketing, PR, comms, your product marketing, and really your outbound advertising. I think some of those are the 4 or 5 key teams that you'll want to start building up.
So is that person that the first hire you're making, they should have had experience in all of those areas, or?
Ideal. I mean, it's hard, right? I mean, like there's a gazillion startups right now, and everybody's going after the same people. So I think you go for what you can. If you can find someone that's got that experience, great. But I mean, I don't know. Like I was in the consumer space for 10 years, and I switched over when I was at Fox and News Corp, and I switched over to Salesforce. And I think in a lot of ways, like you can find great hires that have come from maybe a little bit outside of your traditional area. They're going to come in with fresh ideas and different ways to approach it.
Gary, I know you've spent a lot of time with startups and we're early at eBay.
Yeah, I mean, I would bet on somebody young, actually. So I was at Google just before I was at Facebook, and there's an APM program which is kind of famous there. But there's also one that's in marketing where they have kind of get people right out of college. And I would say a lot of the energy out of the marketing department is from those. I used to call myself a puppy, so I said from those puppies. And having those kind of young talent in an organization, you probably can afford a couple of them. And I think it's just a good way to kind of start, particularly because particularly if I'm looking more at the consumer folks, and that's more my background, but if you're doing something in mobile, they actually don't think of like mobile as a thing. It's like, it just is. And I think that kind of sense of how you think about marketing, how you think about the consumer experience is kind of pretty cool to get somebody who's young and kind of aggressive in that way.
Yeah, so I know everyone in here is fighting and competing for talent. Where are we finding these folks, guys? Where can these folks find the brilliant young minds of marketing today? Jennifer?
Marketing talent's really hard to find, right? So I agree with what both Bill and Gary said. When you think about who to hire, I don't necessarily think small startups need the VP of marketing because they're going to be pretty overpaid for the experience level that you're looking for. So what I have found important is you can get consultants in who can come and help like think strategically, provide some thought leadership. But then if you have an on-the-ground marketer, ideally with experience across channel, right? You don't want someone very, very junior who hasn't had any marketing experience because they're going to result purely to tactical execution without being able to think bigger picture. So I kind of find the sweet spot someone a couple of years out of school, a couple of years out of MBA, who has some experience, is really looking to grow towards that next role, like grow in position, right? Take a bet on the startup, be very interested in the growth of the company. And I think that's probably what you're hearing from us. A lot of us made career changes looking for this kind of move, right? We had very long tenured positions, and then we're looking to do our next best thing. And the type of person you're going to find with that is someone who's willing to take that risk on both themselves and the company. So it's a different kind of commitment to the company. I think in terms of actually finding the talent, referrals are the way to go. There's a lot of great talent moving around right now who aren't essentially on the market, but are open to possibilities if they come up.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. Gary, Jennifer, and Bill.